From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
What I don't want the public to think that these are massive explosions.
We do what's called plume modeling, and that's what we base a lot of the evacuations on. And so, by all means, yes, the plume is incredibly dangerous.
As floodwaters from Hurricane Harvey begin to recede to reveal corpses and widespread devastation along the Texas Gulf Coast, a flooded chemical plant in Crosby was rocked by 2 explosions that sent thick black smoke into the air. While some downplayed the leak, the Federal Emergency Management Agency said the plume of chemicals leaking from the plant is incredibly dangerous. We'll go to Houston to speak with Houston Chronicle reporter Matt Dempsey, who questioned the Arkema CEO about what is in his facility that has caused a 1.5 mile evacuation. We'll also talk to reporter David Sirota. His article's headline, Texas Republicans Helped Chemical Plant That Exploded Lobby Against Safety Rules. We end today's show looking at the corporate crackdown on environmental activists challenging the fossil fuel industry and human-driven climate change. The company that owns the Dakota Access Pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners, has sued Greenpeace International and other environmental groups, accusing them of inciting eco-terrorism. We'll speak with Greenpeace USA's Annie Leonard and Tara Hauska, National Campaigns Director for Honor the Earth. She is Ojibwe with the Cochiching First Nation.
Calling this peaceful prayer a riot. They're calling us the terrorists. They're the ones who are armed. These are unarmed men, women, and children who want nothing more than protect their own waters and protect it for all future generations.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Houston, Texas, floodwaters from Hurricane Harvey have begun to recede, revealing human remains and mass devastation to the nation's 4th largest city. Texas officials say at least 44 people were killed by the storm and nearly 100,000 homes are damaged by flooding. More than 30,000 people remain in shelters. Health officials are taking steps to minimize the spread of diseases such as cholera and typhoid, and nearly 150,000 homes have been told to boil their water. East of Houston, in hard-hit Beaumont, drinking water remains completely shut off, and emergency workers have begun evacuating Beaumont's main hospital. This comes as a chemical plant about 25 miles northeast of Houston in Crosby, that's swamped by about 6 feet of water, saw 2 explosions early Thursday, sending thick black smoke into the air. The Harris County Sheriff's Office downplayed the threat posed by the plant's chemicals, but Federal Emergency Management Agency head Brock Long said a plume of chemicals leaking from the plant is incredibly dangerous.
So the bottom line is that we do what's called plume modeling, and that's what we base a lot of the evacuations on. And so, by all means, yes, the plume is incredibly dangerous.
Officials in Crosby had already evacuated residents within a 1.5 mile radius of the plant, which is believed to produce highly volatile chemicals known as organic peroxides. But the company's CEO has refused to say precisely which chemicals were produced or how much of them are on site. After headlines, we'll go to Houston for more on the environmental catastrophe left behind by Hurricane Harvey. In South Asia, heavy monsoon rains continue to inundate Nepal, India, and Pakistan, leaving more than 1,200 people dead and a third of Bangladesh underwater. In Mumbai, India, rescue workers scrambled to reach more survivors trapped in the rubble of a 6-story building that collapsed following torrential rains and flooding, as the death toll in the disaster rose to 33. In the Pakistani city of Karachi, at least 13 people died after heavy monsoon rains caused flooding throughout the region. In Yemen, at least 18 people are dead, with dozens more missing after monsoon rains triggered flash flooding across Yemen. Large parts of Yemen have been left in ruins after more than 2 years of bombardment from the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition. Al Jazeera is reporting damage to infrastructure includes drainage systems that may have contributed to the death toll. Meanwhile, in Niger, thousands of people were left homeless this week after torrential rains pounded the capital, Niamey. Niger's government says at least 44 people have died from extreme weather since the rainy season began in June. Scientists have linked increasing rainfall and deadly flooding to climate change from human activity. Back in the United States, President Trump's expected to decide the fate of the immigration policy known as DACA as early as today, threatening to overturn the Obama-era program that protects nearly 800,000 undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. Fox News, Reuters, and McClatchy all reported Thursday Trump will end DACA, citing an unnamed senior administration official who said the U.S. will let DACA recipients remain in the U.S. for up to 2 years until their work permits expire. But at the White House, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders insisted the president has not yet come to a decision. Immigrant rights groups and their allies have pledged mass mobilizations in response to any move to cancel DACA. Organizers of the Women's March on Washington tweeted Thursday, "Dear real Donald Trump, if you end DACA, we will make your life impossible." Signed the 5 million who marched on January 21st. #DefendDACA. Trump's imminent decision comes a week after he pardoned anti-immigrant Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who was convicted of contempt of court for defying a court order to stop his deputies from racial profiling. Trump's third wife, First Lady Melania Trump, is an immigrant who in 1996 was paid for 10 modeling jobs before she was legally authorized to work in the U.S., this according to the Associated Press. The Trump administration on Thursday ordered the closure of 3 Russian diplomatic buildings in the U.S. in response to a similar move taken by Russia a month ago. Thursday's State Department order will see the closure of Russia's San Francisco consulate, along with trade missions in New York and Washington, D.C. Russia won't be required to reduce the number of diplomatic staff who can be reassigned to other consulates or the Russian embassy in Washington. The move follows the Kremlin's decision in late July to expel 755 U.S. diplomatic staff from Russia after the U.S. imposed new sanctions on Russia over its annexation of Crimea and over allegations that Russia meddled in the 2016 U.S. election. This is White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
We've taken a firm and measured action in response to Russia's unfortunate decision earlier this year. We want to halt the downward spiral, and we want to move forward towards better relations. We'll look for opportunities to do that, but we also want to have equity in the decision.
Special counsel Robert Mueller is teaming up with New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, expanding the investigation into alleged ties between Russia and Donald Trump and his associates. Politico reports the investigation is centered around Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and has collected evidence on financial crimes, including potential money laundering. Schneiderman's presence in the Russia probe raises the possibility that President Trump or his associates could be prosecuted for crimes in New York State. Unlike federal charges, the president cannot pardon people facing state charges. In Iraq, Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi declared Tal Afar liberated from ISIS control Thursday, following a bloody 11-day battle backed by U.S. air power that leveled swaths of the northern Iraqi city. Many civilians had fled Tal Afar ahead of the U.S.-backed offensive, but the journalistic monitoring group Air Wars reported hundreds of civilians were killed by shelling and airstrikes during the campaign. In Syria, up to 20,000 people remain trapped amidst fierce fighting in the ISIS-controlled city of Raqqa, where U.S. airstrikes have left much of the city in ruins. The devastation drew criticism Thursday from Ravina Shamdasani, spokesperson for the United Nations Human Rights Office.
What we are concerned about is that the battle to regain Raqqa is being waged at the expense of civilian lives. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations is concerned that perhaps the coalition forces are losing sight of the reason for this battle. Meaning that if you're going to pummel civilians, if you're going to cause massive loss of civilian life and infrastructure, then what is the point? The point should be to liberate these civilians from ISIL's murderous regime, not to pummel them so that in the end you have a Pyrrhic victory.
Back in the United States, the Trump administration moved Thursday to further undermine the Affordable Care Act, ordering drastic cuts to programs promoting the 2018 open enrollment period on the Act's health insurance exchanges. The administration also ordered cuts to funding for local groups that help Americans navigate the process of getting health insurance. After his efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act failed in the Senate last July, President Trump tweeted, "Let Obamacare implode, then deal." A federal judge has temporarily blocked a Texas law restricting second trimester abortions just before it was set to take effect today. The ruling puts on hold a measure signed by the Republican Governor Greg Abbott in May that outlaws an abortion procedure known as dilation and evacuation, leaving women seeking second trimester abortions with options that are riskier, more expensive, and more difficult to arrange. Thursday's ruling will put the law on hold for at least 2 weeks, giving opponents more time to mount a legal challenge. The Trump administration said this week it's ending the collection of data on the wage gap between men and women, as well as on differences in pay based on race and ethnicity. In a letter to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Trump administration said it's ending the Obama-era rules, which require businesses with over 100 employees to collect pay data. The move was supported by Trump's daughter and White House advisor Ivanka Trump, who previously campaigned for women's equality during her father's 2016 presidential run. Google's executive chair, Eric Schmidt, pressured an influential Washington think tank to fire an employee who wrote a paper critical of the company. That's according to the New York Times, which reports the New America Foundation fired staffer Barry Lynn after he wrote a letter applauding a record $2.7 billion fine levied against Google by European regulators. Google and Eric Schmidt's family have provided $21 million to the New America Foundation, and Schmidt previously served as the foundation's chairman. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said Thursday he's reconsidering an Obama administration plan for a new $20 bill that would swap out a portrait of former President Andrew Jackson for famed abolitionist Harriet Tubman. Mnuchin said he would base his decision on anti-counterfeiting measures, but told CNBC reporters, quote, "It's not something I'm focused on at the moment." In Wisconsin, Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark resigned Thursday as multiple news outlets reported he'll take a job with the Trump administration. It's not clear what role Clark will play, but Politico reported he's likely to take a White House appointment that does not require Senate approval. Sheriff Clark is a staunch supporter of Donald Trump, who's compared the Black Lives Matter movement to the Ku Klux Klan. Clark and his employees face multiple lawsuits alleging they've abused and neglected prisoners at the Milwaukee County Jail in cases that have led to the death of an infant, as well as 38-year-old Terrell Thomas, who died of dehydration after being denied access to water for a week. In Georgia, a Cobb County police lieutenant resigned Thursday just before he was to be fired after video surfaced showing him telling a woman during a traffic stop, quote, "We only kill black people." The dash cam video, taken in July 2016, shows Lieutenant Greg Abbott ordering a woman at a DUI traffic stop to use her cell phone to make a call. The woman indicates she's afraid to reach for her phone because she's seen too many videos of police shootings.
You're not black. Remember, we only kill black people. Yeah, we only kill black people, right? All the videos you've seen, have you seen any white people get killed?
The interaction took place just days after the death of Minnesota motorist Philando Castile, an African-American man who was shot to death by a police officer in an incident that was live-streamed on Facebook by his girlfriend. And New York State environmental regulators have denied a key permit for a natural gas pipeline to a $900 million power plant being built north of New York City. The ruling is a major victory for environmentalists opposing the 650-megawatt plant in Wawayanda, New York, who say it would increase hazardous air pollution and consume gas fracked in neighboring Pennsylvania and other states. Among the opponents of the plant is the Oscar-nominated actor James Cromwell, who was sentenced to a week behind bars for taking part in a nonviolent protest outside the plant's construction site in late 2015. This is James Cromwell speaking recently on Democracy Now!
We basically came up with an idea to chain ourselves together. We changed ourselves together with bicycle locks, and we blocked the entrance to the plant for about, as according to the prosecution, about 27 minutes. And the judge and the prosecution seem to imply that it made absolutely no difference to what happened with this plant, but it does make a difference. What we're trying to get out is the message that this is one instance, but it is happening all around this country and all around the world.
That was James Cromwell speaking on Democracy Now! The day before he went to jail. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hurricane Harvey has been downgraded from a Category 4 hurricane to a tropical depression as it moves over Louisiana and into Mississippi. In Houston, floodwaters have begun to recede, revealing corpses and mass devastation. Texas officials say at least 44 people have been killed by the storm. Nearly 100,000 homes are damaged by flooding. More than 30,000 people remain in shelters. Health officials are taking steps to minimize the spread of diseases such as cholera and typhoid, and nearly 150,000 homes have been told to boil their water. East of Houston, in hard-hit Beaumont, drinking water is completely shut off, and emergency workers are evacuating Beaumont's main hospital. Meanwhile, flooding continues in North Houston as the Neches River surged beyond its banks and is expected to rise another foot by Friday afternoon. This comes as a chemical plant about 25 miles northeast of Houston in Crosby that's swamped by about 6 feet of water was rocked by 2 explosions early Thursday morning that sent thick black smoke into the air. The facility produces highly volatile chemicals known as organic peroxides, and at least 10 sheriff's deputies went to the hospital after inhaling fumes. Officials had already evacuated residents within a 1.5-mile radius of the plant in Crosby after it lost primary and backup power to its coolant system. Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez insisted in an early morning press conference that the plant had not exploded, describing the event as a pop followed by smoke. But Federal Emergency Management Agency head, that's FEMA head Brock Long, said a plume of chemicals leaking from the plant is incredibly dangerous.
So the bottom line is that we do what's called plume modeling, and that's what we base a lot of the evacuations on. And so by all means, yes, the plume is incredibly dangerous.
This comes as the company, Arkema, has refused to state precisely which chemicals are produced or how many of them are still on site at the time of the explosions. During a call with reporters, Arkema CEO Richard Rowe said the company expected the chemicals on site to catch fire or explode and admitted it is a way to prevent a fire or potential. It has no way to prevent a fire or potential explosion near the plant. He was questioned by reporter Matt Dempsey with the Houston Chronicle.
I have the 2015 Tier 2 chemical inventory for your facility. Are you going to provide the most current Tier 2 chemical inventory for the facility to the media?
I don't know that we see the need to do that. I mean, they're all involved with the peroxides that we're discussing.
No, I understand that. There's a lot more detail in the Tier 2 chemical inventories for reporters that could be useful. Just to be clear, though, it sounds like you're not willing to release your current chemical or your Tier 2 chemical inventory to the media.
I mean, we do not see the need at this time to do that.
To talk about what we know about what could blow up at the Arkema plant in Crosby, we go now to Houston, where we're joined by the reporter you just heard questioning the Arkema CEO. Matt Dempsey is a data reporter with the Houston Chronicle who contributed to the investigative series called Chemical Breakdown, which examined regulatory failures of the chemical industry. His latest article, New Explosions Expected at Crosby Chemical Plant. Thanks so much for joining us on Democracy Now!, Matt. Start off by just explaining what do we know at this point about these chemicals in this chemical plant in Crosby?
All right, so yesterday around 8:30 or 9 o'clock, the company sent me a list of the names of the chemicals, but that is not a Tier 2. In fact, I sent a really pretty angry email back saying this is not helpful, this is not what we asked for. And the reason why I want that Tier 2 chemical inventory is because it has the amounts of the chemicals, and it'll tell you what kind of containers those chemicals are contained in. And I've also asked for like a map of the facility. Yesterday at the press conference in the morning, they assured me that they would provide a Tier 2. They assured me they provide a map of the facility. I've gotten neither of those things. I've asked for a bunch of other questions that remain unanswered.
What do you mean by Tier 2, Matt?
All right, so the Tier 2 is a chemical inventory that's required under EPGRA. It's the Emergency Preparedness and Community Right to Know Act, I believe. So that requires companies who have certain types of materials, it's pretty broad, to send a list of what chemicals they have, the names of them, chemical index code, the amounts of them, where they're located, what kind of containers they're in, to local law enforcement, to the state, to local emergency planning committees. And it's supposed to be used for emergency preparedness.
So you were in Crosby yesterday?
Yes.
Can you explain how it's possible that when you have the 10 sheriff's deputies that go off to the hospital, that the public cannot know exactly what chemicals are poisoning people, not to mention the cause of this 1.5-mile radius that has been evacuated around the plant?
Right. It's challenging. I mean, like I said, there is a federal right to know law, but that federal right to know law has a clause in it that says it can't override any state law. And nationwide, not just in Texas, though it's been particularly bad in Texas, that law has been that right to know has been chipped away by states, making it harder and harder to get access to these chemicals. So I can ask questions, I can bug the company, I can send emails and make calls to the state and other agencies, but it's just very difficult to make any progress because they've made it so that they can use terrorism as the threat of terrorism as an excuse in Texas to shut down access to most chemical inventories.
I want to turn to Harris County Fire Chief Bob Royale saying the explosion wasn't dangerous.
We're trying to make sure that our citizens are comfortable in what's going on and that they know the truth. And so with that, these are small container ruptures that may have a sound, may have a sound of a pop or something of that nature. This is not a massive explosion.
Right. Matt Dempsey, your response.
I know Chief Royal. He's a good man. He's actually a really smart expert at hazardous material response for the Harris County Fire Marshal's Office. He's probably one of the most experienced people at that in the country. My impression of what he's doing there is trying to be as accurate and precise about what he's describing to the public as possible. I think especially in response to being in Crosby, there is tons of rumors going on. And it would be easier if if government officials were more clear about what is going on and what's not going on. So my thought is, when I heard that, because I was en route when he said that, my thought when he said that was that he's trying to make sure people don't think that there's going to be like a shockwave blast from this. And he's right. There probably won't be a shockwave type blast, like something you'd see in the movies or something like, or an action movie. But yeah, it's going to be a fire. And my concern continues to be not the organic peroxides exploding and catching fire, which is dangerous. My concern is there are tanks of sulfur dioxide and isobutylene that are very large tanks. In their worst case scenario report that they filed with that Arkema filed with the EPA, that said that, if that stuff ruptures, then we have a really serious problem on our hands. I know people think this is serious. It is. But if that stuff goes out, gets released, then you have a very, very big problem. So I keep asking Arkema, where are the tanks? They say they're in a remote area far away from the organic peroxide. So I've specifically asked, how many feet away? That's why I asked for a map of the facility. Can you show me where the organic peroxides are and where the tanks are so I can reassure people more than just they're far away? And they've refused to have done that at this point.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We're talking to Matt Dempsey, the data reporter at the Houston Chronicle, who is in Crosby, the lead reporter on the paper series Chemical Breakdown, which investigated regulatory failures of the chemical industry. His new article, New Explosions Expected at Crosby Chemical Plant. This is Democracy Now! That's Eric Harding, a Houston resident who went home. His house is flooded, playing his piano, only the keyboard above the water in his house. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue to look at the flooded Arkema chemical plant in the town of Crosby, northeast of Houston, Texas, that saw a pair of explosions early Thursday, sending thick black smoke into the air. Officials evacuated residents within a 1.5-mile radius of the facility, which produces highly volatile chemicals known as organic peroxides. Well, a new investigation reveals the explosions come after Arkema successfully pressured federal regulators to delay new regulations aimed at improving safety procedures at chemical plants. It also found that Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton aggressively attacked a proposed chemical plant safety rule after his election campaign garnered over $100,000 from chemical industry donors. We are still joined by Nat Dempsey of the Houston Chronicle, but we're also joined by going to Denver, by David Sirota, senior editor for investigations at the International Business Times. His news story headlined, Texas Republicans Help Chemical Plant That Exploded Lobby Against Safety Rules. We welcome you, David, to Democracy Now! Before we go back to this chemical plant's history, tell us exactly what happened, David Sirota. How is it possible that people so threatened by this plant, and more explosions are expected, don't publicly know what they're being exposed to?
Well, the rule that is at issue in our story is a rule that was proposed during the Obama era after the explosion, an earlier chemical plant explosion in West Texas. The rule would have required third-party audits of safety procedures at chemical plants. It would have required more disclosure to the community about what is in chemical plants, what specific chemicals are being housed in chemical plants. And it would have mandated better coordination and a closer relationship between chemical companies and first responders and emergency services in those communities. And what ended up happening was, when that rule was proposed, Republicans in Congress, top Republicans, pushed forward a set of bills, both in the House and Senate, to basically delay and effectively kill that rule. And that was a way for them to signal that they wanted the Trump administration to kill that rule. As you mentioned, and in our story, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton also was one of a number of Republican officials who sent a letter to the EPA demanding that the rule basically be withdrawn. It was highly critical of the rule, saying it was overly burdensome to the chemical industry. You had Arkema in a letter to the EPA basically making the same argument. And you had the American Chemistry Council, which Arkema is a member of, which is a big lobbying group in Washington, also making similar arguments. And then what ended up happening was that many Texas Republicans ended up supporting the legislation in the Congress, as they have been getting large campaign contributions from the chemical industry, legislation that would effectively kill those rules. And the Trump administration obliged. The Trump administration delayed those rules until at least 2019. Scott Pruitt issuing that order. Scott Pruitt himself, as Attorney General of Oklahoma, he had demanded that the EPA withdraw those rules while he was running a group that had received $50,000 from the American Chemistry Council. So effectively what happened, you had chemical industry-funded politicians who made sure and were successful in helping the chemical industry, including Arkema, lobby to delay and effectively, at least for now, kill those safety rules.
So these rules, the company, Arkema, poured millions of dollars into lobbying right after the Trump administration because the rules were going into effect on March 14th?
Yeah, well, many chemical companies, including Arkema, were lobbying against these rules. By the way, during the Obama administration and then into the Trump administration era, through, again, lobbying groups like the American Chemistry Council, Arkema also lobbied on the rules. Other companies lobbied on the rules. I mean, ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, SABIC, the Saudi Arabian part government-owned chemical conglomerate lobbied against these rules, and they were successful. And again, as campaign cash had flowed into the coffers of many Republicans from Texas, who ended up supporting the legislative effort to get rid of the rules, and ultimately the Trump administration acted.
I wanted to bring Stephanie Thomas into this conversation, Houston-based organizer for Public Citizen. Your response to what's happening right now in Crosby, to what the public has a right to know?
Yes, Amy. Yesterday, I drove from Houston to Baytown, which is about 15 miles south of Crosby. And in that drive, I could see the plume of smoke coming toward that community. And people are very concerned about their health, about their well-being, whether the air that they're breathing is really safe to breathe. And there's this complication because right now, there's also a lot of flooding that has happened in our area. So even though they did evacuate the 1.5 mile radius, there were people outside of that radius who were considering evacuating and weren't sure if it was safe to do so, if the roads were going to be passable, because we still have a lot of water on the ground here. And I think another point of this is it's contributing a lot more concern about air quality. We already have seen a lot of reports to TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, about emission events during the past week due to Hurricane Harvey. So people are very concerned about what they're breathing in and whether this is as safe as the officials are saying that, that it's safe.
I mean, this issue of emergency responders, you have the sheriff's deputies, 10 of them went off to the hospital.
That's right. But there have been other folks saying, well, it's like a barbecue. You don't want to breathe the air in because it's not good for you. But they're downplaying the safety of it. So I think it's really important for the community to find out what it is that they're breathing. And I really want to commend Matt Dempsey for his work in trying to get those answers.
So, Matt Dempsey, you were able, first you asked CEO Rowe of Arkema on the telephone. He said he wasn't going to give you the information. Then you sort of got a little info dump from the company. What changed in that amount of time? And what would you say to people now, given the information that we know?
So the only thing I can think of that changed is there was a lot of attention to the presser that where they said they wouldn't provide it. And then I believe, so the other thing about the info dump that I got, that just list of chemical names, like 29 chemical names, and that's all it is, right? That was, I sent a very angry email asking why did I not get the tier 2? And their response was that the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality has informed them that all requests for the tier 2 should go through them. The interesting thing about that is that means we probably won't get access to that tier 2 ever, because when Greg Abbott, now Governor Greg Abbott, was then Attorney General, his office issued a ruling that said that people don't have the right to access tier 2s from the state. So now the state is telling a private company, Arkema, to ask the state for information that they know they are not going to provide. It's really incredibly frustrating.
Now, your knowledge, Matt Dempsey, of the Texas delegation, the congressional delegation, that got money and was lobbied by Arkema to exempt them from these right-to-know laws.
Yeah, so I thought David's piece was really excellent, but I do want to point something out. I don't think it's a hard push to convince politicians in the state of Texas to do what the chemical industry wants them to do. Like, for example, there was a lot of focus on the Republican delegation from Texas. Democrats haven't done very much either. Like, there's been very few bills proposed by Democrats in Texas or in the Ship Channel or in the Houston metro area or along this petrochemical capital of the country from either party on increasing or strengthening right-to-know laws. The stuff that the rules that David was bringing up, That was done by President Obama as an executive order after the West incident. And the American Chemistry Council is extremely powerful. They basically call the shots when it comes to what people get to know and how the chemical industry is regulated. Like a really good example is it took decades for the Toxic Substance Control Act to finally get passed. And in a lot of ways, it only passed because Frank Lautenberg died, and his colleagues in Congress felt
the New
bad
Jersey
that they hadn't passed it
senator
up to that point. Yeah, right. So even then, though, the only version of the Toxic Substance Control Act, which is more about consumer effects by those substances, the only version of it that passed through Congress and got signed into law is the one that the American Chemistry Council essentially approved of.
Can you talk more, David Sirota, about the role of Scott Pruitt? Scott Pruitt, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, when it came to what the public has a right to know. And, of course, we're seeing it playing out right now with, for example, in Crosby with the company Arkema.
Sure. Scott Pruitt, when he weighed in on the proposed safety rules that we're discussing as Attorney General of Oklahoma, Scott Pruitt made an argument that many attorney generals who were opposed to these rules in the states, that they were arguing as well. And that argument was essentially that the expanded mandates for the public's right to know, the expanded mandates for those would threaten national security by allowing the bad guys, basically terrorists, to know where dangerous chemicals are. So they were basically arguing by allowing the community to know where potentially hazardous, poisonous material is, both in normal practice and even during and after a catastrophe or a crisis, that even allowing the public to know would potentially empower terrorists to know that information and organize attacks potentially on those chemical plants. And that, so thereby their argument was, Scott Pruitt's argument was, that allowing the public to know would be an undue risk for national security, and he said that the rules should be withdrawn. Now, the other side of the argument was, of course, that the public should have a right to know about the chemical compounds in its communities, especially when it comes to emergency situations. But ultimately, the Scott Pruitt side won out because he went on from Oklahoma Attorney General to become the EPA administrator, who eventually and ultimately delayed and effectively, at least for now, killed those rules.
Let me ask you, Matt, talk about the record of Arkema over the years.
So the Arkema facility in 2011, and I believe it was 2015, was cited by TCEQ for essentially for a fire that started with organic peroxides in 2011, and I believe in 2016 for not being able to control the temperature in a reactor very well. And then last August, the OSHA fined them tens of thousands of dollars for mishandling, having essentially process safety violations for hazardous materials. Essentially, they were mishandling hazardous materials.
We're talking about the Arkema plant in Crosby. I want to go to a clip of the local CEO, but before I do that, I just wanted to ask, in terms of circumstances on the ground, for Matt, how are you doing? How is your house flooded? How is it to work under these circumstances?
Right. My family is incredibly fortunate. Our neighborhood got flooded. We had water in the street in a lot of areas, and some houses got flooded near us, but the water never got up to like our driveway or over the curb near our house. So I feel incredibly lucky and fortunate, and actually I feel a little bit of survivor guilt because so many other people have been impacted so strongly by the floods. It's a little easier to get around now, but when you're driving around, just even getting to the studio today, you see just people starting to already gut out their homes and doing demolition, and you see sandbags out still, and there's debris all over the road still. It's really hard, even though Houston's had 3 major flooding events in the last 3 years. It's still really, this is different. It's a different kind I'm from Phoenix, and when I moved here 3 years ago, every subsequent flood event that we had up to this point, people used to say, oh, it's not as bad as Tropical Storm Allison. No one's saying that anymore, in a not good way. It's rough. It's really rough.
And Stephanie, what about you?
Yeah, I am likewise lucky that my house did not experience any flooding. We just had some minor damage with some water coming in through the roof. But I live not too far from Buffalo Bayou, which is one of the bayous going through town. And you may be aware, Houston has no zoning, and our neighborhood actually has some industry smattered amongst it. And I was taking a walk along the bayou and encountered a spill coming out of one of the facilities into the water, into the Buffalo Bayou. And I'm noticing that there's been several of these small events happening locally too, as well as these big events like the Arkema chemical fire.
Actually, you know, that brings up a good point. So the analysis we did for chemical breakdown showed that there was a number of facilities. We essentially made an index that ranked facilities on their potential for harm, and we had like 55 facilities that were like the highest potential for harm. I'm doing a really shortcut version of this, but a really, really quick and dirty analysis that I need to go into more detail on that I did yesterday showed that there's 13 of those 55 are in the 100-year floodplain. We're way past the 100-year floodplain with this flood. In fact, Arkema was in the 500-year floodplain. So one of the things that I want to do as a reporter going forward is find out just how many of these facilities that have highly potentially dangerous chemicals got impacted by this flood, and we just haven't heard about it. There's more than 2,500 chemical facilities in Houston. They're all shut down due to the flooding, and they're all going to start up soon. This Chemical Safety Board sent out a safety alert yesterday warning companies to be extra careful and make sure they're doing their due diligence on doing startups, because startup and shutdowns is when most incidents occur. And so I'm genuinely worried, both from an environmental perspective and from a public safety, and a hazard perspective like Arkema. You know, what's going to happen when all of these facilities all spin up all at the same time after encountering essentially like biblical proportion flood?
Yeah, and along with that, a lot of the advocacy work that I've been involved with alongside many other really wonderful organizations in Houston, we have focused a lot on the ship channel. And Arkema is actually not really directly in our focus because it's further back, but I think we're finding a new normal where these incredible rainfall amounts, I mean, there was about 42 inches, I think, in Mont Belvieu, which is close to Crosby. These are just phenomenal rates of rainfall within short periods of time. So when people in industry consider risk management, I don't know that they're thinking about risk management in that kind of way in terms of the amount of rainfall that they're experiencing. This is a whole new ballgame, and people need to start thinking about things differently.
I want to go to Arkema President Richard Renard, the president of the Arkema division, speaking on Thursday.
I mean, it's, I don't know the composition of the smoke, but it's certainly noxious.
You're not going to say that they're non-toxic, correct? Are you going to say they're non-toxic or you're not? Yes or no? I think it's a pretty important.
I mean, the smoke is noxious. Its toxicity is, it's a relative thing.
The toxicity is a relative thing. Matt, we're going to end with you on this point. This is after the explosions, after people are evacuated for a 1.5-mile radius. Can you respond to what he has said?
Well, in some way, in a weird, like, pedantic kind of way, he's right. Toxicity is relative. So the government does measures like exposure rates for certain chemicals. And the way they measure it is like how much of a chemical will kill you, how much of a chemical will disable you so you cannot get away to help yourself. And then how much of a material will be very uncomfortable. You won't like it, but you'll be able to get away. You'll be able to remove yourself from the situation. So toxicity is relative, but it's kind of nonsense to say toxicity is relative and not explain how toxic then. It's almost like a joke. So it's toxic. Well, how toxic? Even though we won't say that it's toxic. So my thought, honestly, from what I know of the stuff that's burning the organic peroxides, is that it's more likely that we're experiencing exposure levels on that last part, that it's irritating, it's uncomfortable, it'll affect people with cardiovascular disease or asthma. But it's something you could probably escape from. You can get to your home, you can shelter in place if you needed to. But
Matt, very quickly,
like I said, yeah, go ahead.
Do you expect more explosions at the plant?
Oh, absolutely. The company has said that. The company has said they expect all 8 of those freezer trailers that each have 32,000 pounds of organic peroxides to explode in the coming days.
We're going to leave it there. Matt Dempsey, thanks so much for being with us, lead reporter for the Houston Chronicle series Chemical Breakdown, which investigated regulatory failures of the chemical industry. Stephanie Thomas, Houston-based organizer for Public Citizen, both speaking to us from Houston, the Petro Metro. And David Sirota of the International Business Times will link to your piece as well. Texas Republicans help chemical plant that exploded lobby against safety rules. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be speaking with the head of Greenpeace here in the U.S. Stay with us.
For so long, I dreamed a dream where the sweet grass still grows and where the wise ones still know how to dream. For so long, I dreamed a dream where the people spoke their tongue and where the elders still teach the young. I dreamed a dream. To those that dream, I sing this song above and beyond, beyond the sky, beyond the sky they dream. To those that dream above the stars, wherever they are, beyond the sky, beyond the sky they dream. For so long, I dreamed a dream where the fighters laid down their guns.
To Those Who Dream by Joanne Shenandoah here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the unprecedented flooding exacerbated by climate change continues in Houston, Texas, we end today's show by looking at the corporate crackdown on environmental activists trying to stop the fossil fuel industry and human-driven climate change, at least challenge the industry. The company that owns the Dakota Access Pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners, has sued Greenpeace International, Earth First, and other environmental groups, accusing them of inciting eco-terrorism against the pipeline's construction. The pipeline's construction was delayed for months last year after thousands of Native Americans led by the Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota and their non-Native allies launched a nonviolent encampment to stop the pipeline from crossing the Missouri River, saying a spill could contaminate the drinking source for millions. Earlier this year, the Trump administration green-lighted both the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL Pipeline. The Dakota Access Pipeline goes taking oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois, then hooking up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Annie Leonard, Executive Director of Greenpeace USA, and Tara Hauska, National Campaigns Director for Honor the Earth. She's Ojibwe from the Cochicheng First Nation. Annie Leonard, you are named both personally and as Executive Director of Greenpeace USA in this lawsuit brought by Energy Transfer Partners. Can you respond?
Yeah, actually, I brought the lawsuit here. For those on the radio, you can see I'm holding up a 4-inch stack of papers. We were just served yesterday with this lawsuit. This lawsuit is a SLAP suit. SLAP means strategic lawsuit against public participation. And that's what it is. It is an attempt to criminalize and silence protest at the exact time that this country needs people rising up more than ever.
So explain what it is that this suit alleges that you've been involved with, using terms like eco-terrorism.
Right. Well, the term eco-terrorism was used really just to taint constitutionally protected, science-based free speech advocacy. They're trying to criminalize healthy, righteous protest. The suit alleges two specific charges. One is defamation, which is sort of lawyer speak for lying. They're saying that we lied to exaggerate the environmental and human rights impacts of the pipeline. The second one that is really ludicrous on so many levels is that they're claiming that Greenpeace was the head of a criminal enterprise that orchestrated all of this protest. And that's the RICO part of this lawsuit. But again, it's not really about the facts. It's not really about the law. If you read this massive document, the allegations are absolutely ludicrous. What it's about is trying to intimidate, silence, and chill protest. Right now, our government has stepped back from offering any kinds of protection for human rights and public health. And the fossil fuel industry thinks that they have just absolute free rein to go for it. The one thing in the way is public opposition. It's civil society, it's activism. And so they're trying to squelch that, not to punish us for Standing Rock, but also to squelch it moving forward. And that's just simply not going to happen. We are not going away. We will not be intimidated. We will not be silenced.
The law firm that is representing Energy Transfer Partners is President Trump's, well, his former White House lawyer. Is that right?
Right. It's President Trump's go-to law firm. And this is actually the second lawsuit that this firm, Kasowitz firm, has filed against Greenpeace in the last year. Last year, they filed a lawsuit on behalf of a large Canadian logging company called Resolute. It was a very similar lawsuit, accusing us of racketeering and all sorts of criminal activity. That lawsuit, we have a motion to dismiss that lawsuit. It's going to be heard October 10th in San Francisco. So if all goes well, that case will be dismissed, but then we still have this one to face.
I wanted to bring Tara Houska into the conversation with Honor the Earth. The Red Warrior Camp is also named in this lawsuit. Can you respond to the owner of the Dakota Access Pipeline suing the environmentalists who've been protesting for a year?
I mean, you're basically seeing a corporate head that is seeking all of the allies and support mechanisms that were in place for the indigenous-led movement that happened at Standing Rock. This was people showing up and deciding to give up potentially their freedoms and put themselves on the line to stop a pipeline that was going through the drinking water of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation and all the people living along the Missouri River. To say that this is somehow some type of criminal operation, orchestrated by Greenpeace and all these folks who really didn't have a very large presence there, this was indigenous-led. These people were supporting what we were doing, not leading and, trying to manipulate us. I thought it was particularly disparaging and paternalistic that they basically characterized these organizations as misleading the tribes somehow and misleading the indigenous people.
You are not named.
No, I am not personally named. I thought it was actually very careful of them not to name any particular indigenous organization, even though the indigenous organizations were out in front of this. Instead they labeled Red Warrior Camp, which is interesting again because Energy Transfer Partners is the one who hired Tiger Swan and all of these counterintelligence operations and private security, whose main mission was to go in and infiltrate and cause, division within the indigenous organizations and indigenous peoples there. This has come out now in several Tiger Swan reports that have been issued by Intercept. And so, you're seeing them trying to, again, demonize and divide, indigenous movement organizing.
Let's talk more about that. Turning to those reports by Tiger Swan, the private military contractor hired by Energy Transfer Partners to carry out extensive military-style counterterrorism efforts targeting the indigenous-led movement at Standing Rock. In one report, Tiger Swan discussing how to use its knowledge of internal camp dynamics, writing, quote, exploitation of ongoing native versus non-native rifts and tribal rifts between peaceful and violent elements is critical in our effort to delegitimize the anti-DAPL movement, unquote. In the documents, Tiger Swan also repeatedly calls the water protectors insurgents in the movement an ideologically driven insurgency. Tara, you are also a lawyer.
Yeah, no, I mean, and they refer to us as jihadists and, try to characterize us as somehow these radical people who are instead non-violently, peacefully trying to stop the construction of a pipeline. This is people walking in front of machines, people peacefully resisting, sitting down in the middle of the road. Yet somehow, you know, had snipers trained on us around the clock, had helicopters overhead, attack dogs that you were there for, attack dogs being unleashed on men, women, and children. Trying to stop the destruction of a sacred site. This is like, you know, you look at this and you think, okay, so you're the company that behaved very, very badly, and you were caught. You were exposed to a large, large audience that typically a big oil would not be exposed to. And you are also exposed to a lot of banks now looking at this and saying, we don't want any part of this, and a movement that's now focusing on divestment and looking at these banks and saying, okay, pull your money out of this project, and they are.
And, of course, we were there on Labor Day weekend a year ago. We filmed the dogs that were unleashed on the water protectors. And I should say that we also, while not named defendants in this case, are mentioned in the lawsuit. Now, Annie Leonard, this is a racketeering lawsuit. Very quickly, if you can talk about what that means.
Right, that's the RICO lawsuit approach that this is a SLAPP suit is taking. Realize it is a SLAPP suit. The RICO racketeering is just a type of SLAPP suit, but it is still a lawsuit designed to squelch public advocacy. The racketeering is the part about us being the head of a criminal enterprise, where they say that Greenpeace orchestrated this entire criminal enterprise. If found correct, we could then potentially be liable for anything that anyone did on Standing Rock, because the theory is that we orchestrated it. The response is number one, nothing that was done was criminal. It was nonviolent, it was science-based, it was values-led, it was peaceful. And the second thing, as my sister here said, is that this movement was Indigenous-led. Greenpeace was very proud to stand up in support, in solidarity, but this was an Indigenous-led movement, and it is false and really offensive to say that Greenpeace orchestrated this. We were not the leaders here. We were a strong ally, and we don't regret a bit of showing up there.
Tara Houska, we just have a minute, but I wanted to ask you of Honor the Earth. We're having this conversation in the midst of what could be the greatest catastrophe this country has seen in the greater Houston area, the epicenter of the fossil fuel industry. Can you respond to the hurricane, now a tropical depression, and the massive devastation we're seeing on the Gulf Coast?
We're seeing something that's, you know, people have to acknowledge and step back and have a real conversation about climate change and our contribution to it. You know, this is what happens. Severe storms, increased pressure towards our very existence. You know, these are coastal states where we are at this is an epicenter of fossil fuel extraction and refining and all of that's happening down in that area. And now people have toxic water sitting in their front yards. We need to have a frank and open discussion about climate change and acknowledge the fact that we cannot engineer our way out of this.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Annie Leonard, who is the Executive Director of Greenpeace USA, who is named both personally and as Executive Director of Greenpeace in this lawsuit brought by Energy Transfer Partners that owns the Dakota Access Pipeline, and Tara Houska, Honor the Earth. In the last 10 seconds, Annie, how is this affecting your work?
You know, they're trying to silence and intimidate us. It is a burden, absolutely. We are putting our top staff on this, but it is absolutely not going to silence us. And in fact, it is emboldening us, and we are going to be stronger and more unified with other environmental groups and Indigenous groups moving forward. So we're stronger than ever.
Thanks so much to both of you. That does it for our show. If you'd like a transcript of the video audio podcast, go to democracynow.org. Sign up for our news headlines. You can send the word Democracy Now! One word to 66866. Very happy birthday to Democracy Now!'s Hani Massoud. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis-Diener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Massoud, Jarina Nadura. I'm Amy Goodman. Go to democracynow.org to see Dolores Huerta's response to DACA. Stay with us.